Welcome, everyone. We're talking today with John Bardes at Louisiana State University, and we're going to discuss an article that he published in American Quarterly earlier in 2020 about the slave rebel Bras Coupé. Welcome, John.
Hello.
I guess the first thing to ask is just, can you give us a quick overview of what do we know about Bras Coupé, and sort of how do we know that? What are the sources that we have for who this guy was and what he did?
Yeah, so Bras Coupé lived and died in antebellum New Orleans. He was killed in 1837. What we know about Bras Coupé very much emerges long after emancipation in the 1880s with George Washington Cable, who was at the time this very famous Southern Gothic writer who grew fascinated with documenting Black folklore in the South. He lived in New Orleans and kept meeting people, white and Black, who were fascinated with this story of this one-armed man named Bras Coupé. And as he lived in New Orleans, he kept on encountering many different versions, and in some cases, contradictory versions of this Bras Coupé folktale. So in 1880, George Washington Cable published a bestseller, The Grandissimes, which included a story of Bras Coupé as a story within the story in that book. And this made Bras Coupé, this brought Bras Coupé to the nation's attention. He was very briefly something of a household name among literary circles. Now, he had no idea initially that Bras Coupé was based on a real person named Squire. And this is where policing records from the 1830s and newspaper accounts from the 1830s were able to flesh out the basic details of Squire's life. So Squire was enslaved just outside of New Orleans. According to oral folklore, he had a close relationship with his owner and was well treated, although we obviously need to take all those kinds of oral accounts with several grains of salt. He was very loyal to his master in these later oral accounts, and he was a crack shot. This is what oral folklore tells. What we do know is that definitively is that in around 1834, he fled New Orleans and set up a camp in the swamps north of the city. And he, along with other Maroons, began raiding neighboring plantations for supplies. In 1836, a slave patrol set out to capture Squire and his band, and a fierce gun battle erupted. Squire opened fire on this white patrol, which was something that was a tremendous act of defiance in the 1830s, where it was only 5 years after Nat Turner's revolt. So for an enslaved Maroon to open fire on a white slave patrol instantly captured the city's attention. Squire was shot in the arm during this event, was captured, and his arm was amputated. This is all documented in the original arrest records for Squire, which survive. Police presumed that Squire was going to die from this wound, so he was left unguarded in a hospital. He escaped, fled back to the swamp, and resumed his this kind of waging this guerrilla warfare against the plantations in his area from the swamp. So I've so far found about 4 accounts of whites who ventured into the swamp to capture him and were killed. And we don't know, of course, if Squire himself killed them. We know that whites begin dying in the swamp when they go looking for Bras Coupé. A massive bounty was placed on his head, and in 1837, he was betrayed by a friend, murdered, and his body was brought to Jackson Square, the main public square in New Orleans, and displayed. And the newspapers reported that some 2,000 to 3,000 enslaved people were forced marched past Squire's corpse to prove to them that he was really dead and that his revolt had been defeated. So that's really all we know about the factual details of Squire's life. We have just a few documents that confirm broadly some of the details that would later emerge in oral history.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. And also one of the things you point out is that he sort of exists in the middle of a long tradition of Black rebels against slavery and later different forms of white supremacy. And in particular, there's some Haitian antecedents, and then also an 18th century local New Orleans antecedent. Can you say a little bit about sort of who they were and how Bras Coupé fits in this sort of longer chain of Black rebels?
So throughout the Caribbean, there is a circum-Caribbean tradition of deifying historic Maroons, transforming historic Maroons into semi-mythical figures, and using stories of those Maroons as a way of describing and celebrating and discussing Black resistance to white power. In particular, in pre-revolutionary Saint-Domingue, there were large numbers of enslaved people who escaped to swamps and mountains and established Maroon camps. Several of these Maroon leaders rose to prominence among local enslaved communities, and in particular, Haitian voodoo came to deify a figure named Francis Mackandal, who is a historic rebel who would later be mythologized as this man with magical powers, leading revolutionary war against whites, brewing magical potions, impervious to bullets. And the fascinating detail about Mackandal for our purposes is he had one arm, which was powerfully associated with this fact that he had one arm. In Louisiana, we also see Saint Malo in the late 18th century, a historic Maroon who also set up a Maroon camp outside of the city, was eventually captured, executed, and his corpse was displayed in the exact same place that Bras Coupé's corpse would be displayed, a generation later. So refugees from the Saint-Domingue Revolution, thousands of them fled into New Orleans, and they brought stories of Mackandal and these other Maroon leaders with them. When Squire led his rebellion, it's clear that they merged stories of Mackandal together with stories of Squire, aka Bras Coupé. And the evidence for this is that we see facets of the Bras Coupé oral history that don't appear in the original accounts of Squire's revolt, but that do appear in oral histories surrounding Mackandal or St. Malo's revolt. That it's clear that they're merging these different stories together. For example, the belief that Squire or Bras Coupé used magic potions which rendered him impervious to bullets. That's something that we see in accounts of Mackandal. That's not something that we see in the original newspaper accounts of Squire, but it becomes a major focus of folklore surrounding Squire after his death. Through the 19th century and into the 20th century, Louisiana voodoo worshipped Maroons as, there is a Saint Maroon in Louisiana voodoo. It's unclear, or perhaps the boundaries are deliberately blurry, as to whether Saint Maroon is Saint Malo, is Bras Coupé, or is a mixture of all these different Maroon figures, these historic figures that have become merged together into one semi-mythical character.
Mm-hmm. And in some ways, we can almost flash forward a bit to Robert Charles in 1900, who's sort of maybe the next big figure in that tradition in some ways. But before then, one of the points that you make is that, and I suppose this is true sort of all around the Caribbean, is that Maroons were sort of offered a evidence of Black self-determination and sort of self-governing ability and so forth, which is one of the reasons that they were so threatening to the white plantation establishment and needed to be rooted out, more than just the occasional raid on plantations and stuff. And I wonder do you see any sort of connection between Maroons like Bras Coupé and then when African Americans actually have the chance for self-determination during Reconstruction?
Maroonage provided enslaved people with a framework through which to understand freedom's meaning, right? It provided, thinking about Maroonage provided enslaved people with a way to think about the political meaning of freedom. It provided a template for a Black vernacular political thought. And one sees this in the way that enslaved people in Louisiana deployed stories of Bras Coupé's Maroonage and other similar stories of enslaved people establishing autonomous communities in swamps. Because Maroonage was so critical to how enslaved people defined freedom, I think during Reconstruction we see that formerly enslaved people's vernacular political language led them to a different way of thinking about what freedom meant. In particular, I think that the ability among free people to move and exist autonomously, these were not privileges won because of freedom. These were essential to their very definition of freedom. Movement, just the simple ability to move autonomously was profoundly, profoundly meaningful to formerly enslaved people during Reconstruction. And I think that has a lot to do with the ways that Maroonage had previously provided them with a way to think about freedom's meaning.
That's kind of like we were talking before we started recording about 1865. Obviously is a significant date, but there are interesting continuities across 1865 in terms of, as you're saying there, about ideas of freedom, which is sort of reminds me a bit of Steve Hahn's argument that African Americans didn't emerge into Reconstruction
Right.
with absolutely no political experience and so forth, that they came into this with some momentum developed in other areas and so forth. Maybe one final thing to talk about is about the swamp itself. And what does the sort of white New Orleanians' attitudes and ideas about the swamp sort of tell us about their relationship with the environment more generally? And to a great extent, we think about the relationship between the citizens of New Orleans and their environment through the relationship with the river. But in some ways, it suggests here, I think your work, that the swamp is also something we really need to consider.
The people of New Orleans and Louisiana writ large have been fighting a 3-century-long battle against the swamp, trying to push it back, trying to keep it from seasonally inundating their homes and streets. To whites in Louisiana and New Orleans in the 19th century, the swamp came to symbolize the limits of white control and white civilization. They imagined in the swamp not only malaria and yellow fever and noxious fumes and disease, but also the swamp was in the white imagination was the land of racial inferiors. This was the land of American Indians and of Maroons. It was monstrous, it was demonic, it symbolized the limits of white control and civilization. It's very telling that during Hurricane Katrina, as I write in this article, when the swamps, inundated New Orleans, so many civil authorities in New Orleans imagined this flooding in racial terms. That they thought that the fact that the swamps had consumed the city was an act of racial upheaval. That now Black chaos an anti-civilization had been unleashed by this. And this resulted in incorrect reports that African-American gangs were rampaging through the city, which ultimately resulted in police opening fire on and killing several groups of innocuous and unarmed African-Americans trying to flee their own inundated neighborhoods.
Very interesting, very interesting. I think that brings us to a pretty good stopping point. We've sort of gone from the 18th century right up to Hurricane Katrina, and very interesting article, and we really appreciate you taking the time today to speak to us about that. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure speaking with you all.
Great.
Yeah.
Good, let me press the...
Mm-hmm.